Hi, I want to do a video, an introduction to 1 Corinthians. Um, Paul was in Ephesus at the time when he wrote the epistle in AD 56, AD 57. He preached in Corinth in the AD 50s for 1.5 years. He went there 3 times and he established the church on his second missionary journey. Um, and First of all, let's have a look at the town itself. Well, it was a port town, and it was in a busy port in southern Greece. It was cosmopolitan. That means there were people from all over the world there, the known world, including Jews with a synagogue, Greeks who had their philosophy, their beliefs, and Romans who established their religion as well. It was very wealthy, but very immoral. The citizens worshipped Aphrodite, the goddess of love, in inverted commas. The temple of Aphrodite had 2,000 priestesses, who acted as prostitutes. It was a pagan city with idolatry, and it was promiscuous, which means it was immoral, with very loose standards. So, before telling you about the list of the moral context there, Paul, let me just quote 1 Corinthians 6, verse 9 to 10, where Paul says, "These are the former sins of you believers. You were sexually immoral, idolatrous, thieves. Some of you were male prostitutes, homosexuals. You were greedy, drunkards, swindlers, and slanderers." It can't get much worse than that for a cultural context out of which they'd come, but hadn't obviously, although they may have accepted Christ as Saviour, hadn't changed at all in their moral outlook and behaviour. First of all, what about the structure? Well, we have the introduction, chapters 1, verse 1 to 1:9. Divisions in the church basically take up the first 4 chapters, and then incest and immorality and lack of church discipline in chapter 5, lawsuits in chapter 6, 1 to 11, immorality again in 6:12 to 6:20, talking about fornication and prostitution. Paul deals with the principles of marriage, divorce, and singlehood and widows in chapter 7. He deals with debatable issues. That means whether there are disputes about them, about food offered to idols in 8, 9, and 10, and then the appearance of women in worship and their submission in chapter 11, verse 2 to verse 16, headship and covering and to do with hair. Then chapter 11, verse 17 to 34, he deals with the Lord's Supper and the abuse of the supper and the rules of the Lord's Supper. There's a very interesting section in chapter 12, verse 1 to 11 about spiritual gifts. We have a very full description of the gifts, and then how the body functions and the members that each we need one another in chapter 12 to 12:31. Then what some people think is an interlude that's different in chapter 13 about love, but actually it's in the context of the use of the gifts, true love. Then tongues and prophecy and their importance in chapter 14. Chapter 15, 1 to 11, Paul tells us about the true gospel, and then the bodily resurrection of Christ and the believers in 15:12 to 15:58. He has a section on giving in 16:1 to 16:4 in the collection for Jerusalem, and then he talks about his companions in 16:5 to 16:12, and a warning 16:13 to 16:18, and then finally blessings and greetings in 16:19 to 16:24. So that's the structure of it. But in this video, principally, I want to deal with why Corinthians was written. Well, basically, the church was being carnal, or in other words, they were living according to the flesh, not walking in the spirit. And that describes, unfortunately, many Christians today, and it can be for us as well if we're not careful, that we walk according to the flesh. But they were allowing the influence of the city to affect the church instead of the other way around, instead of being salt and light and influencing the city. Paul wrote to correct the many problems in the church and provide a lot of teaching. It's probably the most practical book in the New Testament, and makes fascinating reading and helps us so much when we come to deal with difficulties in the local church. There were divisions and cliques, groups in the church based on their favourite pastor and preacher. It's very easy to have little groups all believing the same thing or speaking the same thing. There was envy and strife, infighting and quarrelling among themselves. We mustn't put one leader on a pedestal or higher than another, but try to receive the word and accept all godly leaders that God's provided in the church and speakers that come from outside. But obviously we need to be discerning and not just accept anybody. We need to prove and see if what they say is biblical and if their lives are godly. So that the church must be united. That's a very important point. There was immorality in the church. A man was committing incest with his stepmother, and others were visiting prostitutes. God forbids any sexual partner before or outside marriage. In other words, it's sinful for a man to have any kind of sex if you're, or young people, for example, living together or having sex outside marriage, or committing adultery once in marriage. Our bodies are the temple of the Holy Spirit, and so we can't just do what we want. One of the problems was to do with Greek philosophy, that the Greeks taught what you did in your spirit, what you did in your body, was irrelevant as long as your spirit was okay. But Paul teaches that how we live out our Christian life is just as important as what we believe and what's happening in our spirit. Our bodies are the Holy Spirit. So the church must be pure in all areas. Members were taking brothers and sisters to court instead of asking godly people to arbitrate, to help them solve disputes for them, or otherwise for them to reconcile together where they had issues. So often in churches today, if somebody has a dispute with somebody else, either they stop going to church or they go to another church down the road. In those days, there was just one local church, so people couldn't go somewhere else. There wasn't anywhere else to go. But Paul talks about the need for spiritual discipline within the church. Members were being very intellectual, and that is a problem that crops up today, where people are relying on their natural ability to preach, their natural ability to organise the church, their zeal, their enthusiasm, which can be good things, but need to be crucified, need to be under the power of the Holy Spirit. And that was what was happening in the Corinthian church. They were relying on natural wisdom to help the church along, and it was obviously not working. They weren't depending on the Holy Spirit. They were depending on clever preaching and clever rhetoric. Some Christians were involved in idolatry. Others were forbidding marriage. That's when Paul says, some say we're not allowed to touch, not allowed to touch a woman. But Paul says marriage is honourable. So Paul teaches about marriage, the right kind of marriage, and he talks about divorce and separation, about singlehood, and even possibly remarriage, as well as talking about widows. Paul explains about women being submitted and about head covering and hair. Some members were getting drunk at the Lord's Supper, were overeating, so he provides teaching about how the Lord's Supper should be administered and why we should keep this ordinance of the Lord, one of the commandments of God. There are only two basic ones in the church, and that's, apart from loving one another, baptism and breaking bread, the Lord's Supper. There was chaos in the meetings, so Paul explains the need for order, not necessarily quiet, not necessarily a sort of dead meeting. He invites lots of people to be involved in sharing and singing and so on. So he's not talking about that, but certainly order in the use of the spiritual gifts and the need for true love. And 1 Corinthians 13 is probably our best description of what love is all about. Paul has to explain the gospel again and teaches about the meaning of resurrection. He talks about the bodily resurrection of Christ and the hope that we have if we believe in the resurrection. One of the most difficult texts in Corinthians is that women should remain silent in meetings. First sight, that sounds terrible, but in another passage, Paul says that they can pray and prophesy, so he's obviously not talking about them totally being silent. A lot of people have misunderstood this text. What he's probably talking about more is advising women not to disrupt meetings by chatting or interrupting or arguing, asking questions publicly. But obviously he wants women to be involved and to be fully involved in the ministry, not necessarily, as I said in a previous video, to be not at all, in fact, to be elders of churches or leaders of church. Obviously, in some situation, in a missionary situation, a woman has to lead until a man can be ordained as a minister. But in a general way, women have tremendous functions in the church, but not eldership, not leadership. In all the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul highlights the problems in a church and solutions. So it's a very practical book, as I said before, very useful, and it helps us to understand just how meetings can be conducted, the use of spiritual gifts, how relationships can go wrong in the church, and what are the reasons and how we can put things right. So I encourage you to read 1 Corinthians. That's just a small introduction to 1 Corinthians. God bless you.